Welcome to this event, particularly to those of you who've travelled a long way. I think it's fair to say from the organisers' point of view that we've been quite overwhelmed by the response for today's symposium. And we're very aware that many of you have travelled a very, very long way to be here, so we're very appreciative of that. My name's Phil Clark, and I'm an advisory board member for Oxford Transitional Justice Research, and I'm also a lecturer at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Today's symposium is co-hosted by three organisations, OTJR, which I belong to, the Boroumend Foundation, and also Geoffrey Robertson and Doughty Street Chambers in London. So from OTJR's point of view, we're really honoured to be co-hosting this event with those two organisations. I'm going to say a little bit in just a moment about today's program and give you a sense of where we're going and how this is all going to fit together. But just briefly to say something about OTJR as an organisation. We're a network of about 100 staff and students here at the University of Oxford who work on transitional societies, so societies that are recovering from either forms of repressive governance or mass conflict. And so we come at these questions of transitional justice from a very wide range of angles. From a theoretical and philosophical point of view, we do a great deal of legal and also political work in this domain. And I think you're going to see from the various speakers that we have presenting to you today a sense of that diversity and that interdisciplinary approach to talking about issues of transitional justice in Iran. So why are we here? What's the purpose of this gathering today? I think it's very clear. The purpose of the discussions that we're going to have from the front of the room, but of course also the discussions that we're going to have from the floor, build upon a report that Geoffrey Robertson wrote last year about prison massacres in Iran in 1988. And the purpose of that report, I think, is to not just detail the atrocities that were committed in those places at that time, but also to say something about what viable and necessary responses to those atrocities might look like. What kind of legal redress is available? What kind of political recourse might there be, either domestically or internationally, to the crimes that Geoffrey talks about in that report? And I should mention too that the report, of course, draws very heavily on interviews and field-based research that Jen Robinson and Geoffrey did, and they're both going to speak to us a great deal about the report today. So we want to talk about the nature of the violations in 1988, their connection to present-day events in Iran and the nature of the current government in Iran, but also to look ahead and to ask these questions about what recourse for the victims of those crimes might look like in a legal, political and other senses. So that's really what we're going to do in three panels today. And of course you've got your program, so you get a sense of what the flow of the discussions is going to be. The first panel is going to talk about the report and talk about the nature of violations in 1988, and also to attempt to put it in some sort of wider political and historical context. Clearly many of you are from Iran and are very familiar with the case that we're going to be talking about today, but it's important, I think, to put it in a wider context so that we know exactly where we're going. The second panel then will look at a range of issues relating to political and legal redress for the violations that we're going to discuss. So four speakers will, I guess, pick the case apart and look at what potential remedies or potential redress to these violations in Iran might look like. And then the third and final panel, I guess, broadens out from the Iran case to look at some important comparative issues. Something that the Boroumend Foundation really emphasised, I guess, to OTJR and to Geoffrey when we were setting up this event was they wanted to learn about other cases of transitional justice, other societies that have had to deal with massive violations in the past and have had to ask these very difficult questions about what viable and necessary responses to previous violations might actually look like. So the purpose of that final panel is to offer some sort of comparative insight. What can be learnt from other societies with a similar political trajectory that may be applicable in the Iranian case? I think by the time we get to that third panel, you'll all be well and truly parched. So we have a wine reception, a drinks reception in the common room next door. I'm sure by that stage the speakers and everybody in the audience will have well and truly earned a drink. So that will be the end of today's events. one tiny housekeeping issue, which is that some people in the audience I know will need translation for today's proceedings. If you do need an English to Farsi translation, please basically put your hand up. And I think many of you already have your headphones and already have the equipment that you need. But if there's anybody who still needs it, you can see the OTJR convener, Nikki Palmer, who's in the aisle at the moment. That's right, isn't it, Nikki?
Yeah, if you just raise your hand up if you want. So does anyone still need translation equipment?
Yeah, I think there's one at the back of the room. A couple at the back of the room. Great. Well, I think you've certainly heard enough from me, and it's really important, I think, now that we get on with this program. We're going, yeah.
The award ceremony.
Yes, I should have mentioned too that during the drinks reception, there'll also be an award ceremony for some victims of the atrocities that we're going to be talking about today, and that's a ceremony that's going to be run by the Boroumend Foundation. But Ladan and Roya from the foundation, I'm sure, will say more about that when we get to the end of the proceedings today. So without any further ado, let me introduce our first speaker today. He really needs no introduction whatsoever. I'm sure all of you are already very familiar with Geoffrey Robertson. Geoffrey is, of course, the founder and the head of the Doughty Street Chambers. You have everybody's biographies in the program, so I don't think we're going to give very long introductions to our speakers today. Geoffrey, of course, has been a judge at the Special Court for Sierra Leone. He's written more on crimes against humanity and international law than any of us will probably have a chance to actually digest. And of course, he's the author of the report that is the foundation of our discussions today. Geoffrey, thank you very much.
Thanks, Phil. I have to say that even though I'd written books on crimes against humanity, I had never heard of the 1988 prison killings in Iran until the Boroumend Foundation approached me a couple of years ago and asked would I inquire into them. I was a judge, recorder, and had sat in the special court as its president. I was prepared to do that. I'd never acted for or against Iran. The only condition I made in doing this report was that the Boroumend Foundation had to cop it, had to take my opinions for what they were. When you read it, you may think that I've got a slightly skewed view of Iranian history. I've done my best. I read hundreds of books. I've interviewed 40 survivors of what I truly found was a massacre that bids, and it's an invidious thing to compare atrocities, but bids comparison with Srebrenica, begs comparison with Katyn Forest, begs comparison with the Japanese death marches, with the other massive atrocities of the single atrocities of the 20th century, atrocities done to prisoners. Why should we bother with something that happened 20 years ago? Why should we worry about it today? Firstly, because it concerns prisoners. Prisoners not of war as it happened, but prisoners taken during a war. Prisoners, the most vulnerable people in any society. So easy to kill, so helpless, so vulnerable. The killing of prisoners, the murder of prisoners throughout history, go back 400 or 500 years to the Civil War. Failing to give quarter was a war crime. There can be nothing so obscene than killing your prisoner. And I discovered that the state of Iran killed in cold blood thousands of them. They killed at least 4,000, perhaps as many as 7,000. They did so in the first wave in August 1988 because they were Maharib, they were enemies of God. They were Mujahideen sympathizers who refused to say that they no longer sympathized. The second wave was basically Marxists killed for apostasy. This, my conclusion as to the facts, you can read in the report, and there is no doubt it happened. Why has international law not come to a stage when it can do something about it? That's one of the issues that we'll be talking about today. But why I think this particular slaughter bears comparison with those other slaughters that we know so much about is that it was carefully planned and executed by state leaders working through the judicial and penal system. The prisons were visited by judges who asked the prisoners one question and then ordered them to be executed. The victims were mainly young people, left-wing students who had ironically supported Khomeini's revolution but had then been arrested for demonstrating against the particularly repressive regime in the early 1980s. And the interesting thing, what differentiates this from Srebrenica and from Katyn, is that these prisoners had been in jail for years. Most of them arrested in the early 1980s. Most had served their sentence, but had been kept in prison as a form of preventive detention. And at the end of the war with Iraq, in July of 1988, all the vengeance was unleashed upon them. Khomeini, the supreme leader, issued a secret fatwa together with Rafsanjani and Khomeini, now the supreme leader, and many others who are now in power. They decided that all their political prisoners in Iran should be exterminated. They couldn't be trusted either because they had sympathized with the Mujahideen or because they were Marxists or atheists. The final solution, killing all these political prisoners without any trial, or any proper trial. They were hauled up before judges for a minute or so. It was effected by this clandestine fatwa issued by the Ayatollah, which appointed death committees. There was a judge, usually a religious judge, a prosecutor, and an intelligence chief who were tasked to visit the prisons and execute all the Mujahideen supporters, male or female, and any other male prisoner who couldn't prove that they believed in God, the God of the revolution. Female atheists were tortured until they either died or they prayed. Between August and November 1988, thousands were killed for this reason. They were blindfolded, taken from their cells in a conga line to be paraded for a couple of minutes before the death committee, which after a few questions would send 95% of them straight to the gallows. There they were hung from cranes, 4 at a time, or in groups of 6 from ropes hanging from the front of the stage in the prison assembly hall. In some outlying jails, they were taken in trucks to army barracks, directed to make their wills, to take showers and put on shrouds, and then they were taken out and shot by a firing squad. Their bodies were doused with disinfectant, packed in refrigerated trucks, and buried by night in mass graves in the section of cemeteries that are reserved for the bodies of common criminals, the places of the damned. Their